I mentioned that there are two really critical moments in the play for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. Um, and I think it's worth sort of looking at them as closely as possible um, in this section. Um, so there's a story of this relationship between one of the women and her partner, um, who is who has just returned from Vietnam. I remember that this play was written during the Vietnam War. Vietnam War ended in 1975, um, and it's essentially one of the most difficult wars that the U.S. fought because, for all intents and purposes, the U.S. lost that war. And there's a great stigma associated with that war. This is a war that went on for about 10 years. It's a war that ended with the U.S. having to shut down their embassies and leave. We had a kind of repetition of that with Afghanistan a few years ago, but this one was more intense. In fact, there's a whole generation of Vietnamese American who came here, especially from Cambodia and of course from Vietnam, who came as refugees because of that war, as a result of that war. It was a brutal war, a war in which many Americans lost their lives, but of course there were many atrocities associated with America's presence in that place as well. And of course, we know that the idea of many of the ideas that have become a given now in terms of the way we think of the effects of war, which existed in the First World War and the Second World War. But the terms like PTSD and the trauma of the war uh, really began to take root with the Vietnam War. One, because it wasn't a popular war. Americans protested against that war intensely and consistently for almost a decade. Um, and secondly, there were many. It was a war that was on television, essentially. It was a war that you could view on TV, that every night there'll be footage of the carnage and the brutality and so on. And we finally have come close to that sensation with the proliferation of social media now, where we can see images of brutality, of violence, and so on and so forth, shot in real time. But certainly prior to Vietnam, this was not available. And even after Vietnam, this was not available. America watched the war, viewed the war, and saw the war, and the war was not very popular. On top of it, it was an interesting war because it was a war um, that Americans were drafted into that war. But that drafting was very, very racially biased and racially dangerous, so that a disproportionate number of the soldiers who fought in Vietnam were African American. And many of them could not get waivers, for university and so on and so forth, which was part of it. It was very class based in terms of what waivers could be given, and so many African Americans fought in that war. So the play sort of moves itself towards this moment where this veteran has returned from the war, and it's clearly suffering from PTSD. He has been violent towards his girlfriend, and she's deciding that this is not going to work. They have two children between them, and what we see is the enactment of a scene in which he is clearly losing it or has lost it emotionally and mentally. He doesn't want to be separated from her and the children, and and in that moment he does something. They're in an apartment. He calls the children to him. She's trying not to let for the children not to go towards him, and they do. They go to their father. And she's describing it. It's a beautiful moment where she's describing the moment where she's pleading with him not to hurt the children. And then he hangs them out of the window of the building. And while she's pleading with him, there's that line, he dropped them and killed the two children. It's a really, really devastating moment. And you can imagine on stage, um, it ends with everybody is broken by that moment. He's a victim. He's a victim of this war. He's a victim of the damage that American society has caused to the black man. But he's also a predator. He's also somebody who is dangerous and somebody who has put her life in danger and eventually has killed their children. And so it is one of those untenable tragedies that Ntosake places right there in the climactic moment of the play. What do you do with that? Leads us to the second, and I think one of the more powerful moments in the play. Because what happens is that she creates a circle of the women gathering around each other and beginning a ritual. And it's clearly moving towards a ritual of healing, but it's also a ritual of self discovery. Because, of course, the woman feels guilty about giving this husband of hers a chance. She feels guilty about being implicated in that moment, and yet, of course, she shouldn't be, because it's really, really something that is not only not her fault, but it's actually brutally and entirely his fault. And yet, not his fault, because, of course, he's a victim of mental illness and, of course, a victim of what happens because of the war. But the women gather around each other and they begin to chant. And one of the phrases that finally finds its way into and has become really a brilliant articulation of a new kind of feminism is when the women say, "I found God in myself," and she's beautiful. It's that simple changing of the pronoun. That first of all, I found God, which seems like a conventional movement towards healing, but that she um, is an upturning of the patriarchal construct and sort of a restoration or sort of establishment of a kind of feminine power and a female power and the power of the power of the female in the self, so that each of these women contain the power of the control of their lives, the power of their agency, the power of their beauty, and the power of their spirituality, all contained in that simple phrase, I found God in myself, and she was, and she is, and she was beautiful, powerful, all the other things that we can say and associate with that. The play ends with this dance and this movement and this power. And I think one of the things to look at as you're thinking about this play is to see how Ntosake Shange is constructing a feminist drama. There are many ways in which the works that we've looked at construct a feminist articulation. Think of Zora Neale Hurston's Sweat, where Delia's action, necessary action, her action to willfully allow Sykes to be killed is her own sort of articulation of her feminist act of resistance, her feminist act of defiance. There is then we see in Lorraine Hansberry the feminine center of the play, where the mother, while she cedes authority to her son, she's actually not ceding authority. That her vision and her views, conservative as they may be, are the ones that will be the dominant ones and the ones that bring healing and transformation to the society. Here in Ntosake Shange's play, the feminine center of the work lies in the ability for the women to speak in their vulnerable ways, but to also be the owners of the space. In other words, they own the narrative and they own the telling of the narrative. And Ntosake Shange died a few years ago. She's somebody I knew, and I met her. I was at an event with her a few years ago in Newark, the Dutch Festival, and she gave a brilliant talk, and she was always a very interesting and very thoughtful writer. She grew up in a very similar way to Lorraine Hansberry among intellectuals and so on and so forth. She had a solid education, and this may not have been the path that she was going on, but eventually she became this playwright, and she produced a number of plays in the style of the Korea poem, and these were plays that have had a tremendous impact on black feminism and black thought in America. And of course, this play is quintessentially one of them. A very personal relationship with that play. I remember reading that play in 1980 in Jamaica. I didn't know anything about it and about her. And it really led me into being a playwright and sort of the beginning of my writing career, because I saw something quite powerful and 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 um, and really affirming in just reading the play in a book in the library at the University of the West Indies. So just a personal connection that I thought I would mention.